Today we're going to break your heart a bit if you're a Panther fanboy. Not because we're mean or have anything against you specifically, but because a lot of facts about this famous World War II cat usually get left out when people talk about its powerful gun and menacing looks. So without further ado, here's the real Panther's story. The Panther was supposed to be Germany's medium tank, but when it was completed, by weight, it was in the category of heavy tanks. German sources even called the IS-2 a super heavy, despite the fact that it weighed almost the same. People still talk about it as one of the most advanced tanks of the war, and sure, it had some really advanced features for the time. We'll come to them, of course, but how useful and practical they were is another question. And that's the part people tend to forget when they praise it. The idea of the Panther actually goes back before the war. German planners were already thinking about what would replace the Panzer IV. They imagined a neat little 20-ton design, which became the VK-20 series, intended to take over from both the Panzer III and IV, and the Panther grew out of that program. Here's the first problem, though, that would haunt it through its whole operational service. The running gear and mechanical systems were built for something around 24 tons, yet the final version ended up at 45 tons. That's nearly double. You can probably guess what happened with engines and transmissions under such strain. Then came the summer of 1941. German troops suddenly found themselves up against the Soviet T-34 and KV-1, which turned out to be much harder nuts to crack than the Soviet light BT tanks the Germans had been decimating at first. It came as a shock when their anti-tank guns suddenly didn't work, so the Wehrmacht quickly sent a Panzer Commission to the front to examine these tanks that were such a pain in the arse. And the Commission, being the Sherlocks they were, realized German tanks needed heavier guns, stronger armor, and better tactical mobility. Now, a lot of people will tell you the Panther was a knee-jerk reaction to the T-34. Not quite. Work on it had already started before the Tiger I was even on the drawing board, but the Soviet nasty surprise did speed things up. And while the Tiger was designed as a heavy breakthrough tank, loaded with armor on all sides, the Panther was meant for a different job. It was supposed to replace the aging Panzer IV in regular panzer companies, giving them better mobility with a much harder punch. The design team at MAN made some interesting choices. They went with torsion bar suspension and a petrol engine mounted in the rear, but the drive sprockets were at the front, so they had to run a long drive shaft under the turret. That pushed the whole tank's height up, and added complexity no mechanic was ever thankful for. The armor was sloped, something that looked suspiciously similar to the T-34. And instead of building the hull in two separate parts, like earlier German tanks, they used interlocking joints with upper and lower sections as one solid piece, making it stronger, but of course harder to produce. And here's where we get to the first trade-off that at first might not seem like much. But look at this. For every 5 Panthers, Germany could have built 6 improved Panzer IVs with the long-barreled 75mm gun that was already deadly enough to all Allied tanks throughout the war. That doesn't sound huge, but this way they had 1,000 tanks fewer, and the ones they did have weren't quite working. But we'll get to that as well. The Panther went from concept to its very first test vehicle in under a year. That sounds impressive, but it's not something they should be proud of, because in reality, it spelled disaster. Hitler demanded the tank be ready for the Battle of Kursk at any cost, so production jumped straight from the drawing board into full swing with almost no real testing. The flaws were obvious right from the start, but they pushed it forward anyway, and the battlefield became the test range instead. What could possibly go wrong? Before the Panthers even reached the front, 2 of them caught fire while being unloaded from trains ahead of Operation Citadel in July 1943. Several more caught fire on the way from the railway station to the front. You may wonder how a state-of-the-art tank managed to set itself on fire. Well, thanks to serious engine and exhaust issues. Here's what was happening. Sometimes the Maybach engine's fuel mixture didn't fully ignite, which sent unburned gasoline into the hot exhaust system. Once there, it ignited, creating flames or even explosions. That fire then spread into the surrounding wiring, setting the engine alight, which crept inside the tank. And in a small space, packed with ammunition, fuel, and 5 people, that was the last thing you wanted, even on the Russian front during winter. Early Panthers also belched flames out of the exhaust at night, making them highly visible targets and attracting artillery fire. They eventually fixed that with flame-suppressing mufflers, but for Kursk, the problem was still there. The first 200 Panther D models rolled into action at Kursk. Within just 2 days, fewer than half of them were still running, and the majority weren't destroyed by Soviet guns, but by their own mechanical failures, breaking down left, right, and center. On the battlefield, things didn't go much better. Already on the first day, Panthers drove straight into Soviet anti-tank ditches, filled with water and bogged down. Then, artillery rained on them. After that, they rolled into extensively prepared minefields. Crews, many of them green and unfamiliar with the new machines, tried to force crossings, only to bog down entire companies before they could even fire a shot. On the very first day, 18 Panthers were lost. On the second, another 37, including one blown apart by friendly fire from a Panzer IV that killed the Panther's whole crew after confusing them for a Soviet tank. The one bright spot was their first tank versus tank engagement, which was a bit ironic. Panthers faced American-built M3 Lees supplied to the Red Army through Lend-Lease, and they destroyed 6 of them. The M3 Lee, however, was not quite the formidable opponent at this time. By the end of Kursk, more than 200 Panthers had been knocked out. Around 130 of those weren't destroyed by enemy fire, but crippled by mechanical breakdowns. If the untested, flaw-riddled tank itself wasn't enough of an issue, crews were also rushed in with almost no training, many pulled from Panzer IV units. They were given literally a crash course, sometimes just a few hours of familiarization more than training, and then sent into combat with a tank they barely understood. Secrecy around the Panther program was so strict that early crews weren't even allowed to take written notes or photos of the tank, so they had to remember only what they could. By the end of 1943, Panthers did score some real victories, however. They were credited with destroying around 500 T-34s for the loss of roughly 100 of their own, which is certainly not bad on paper. But in practice, breakdowns were still sidelining more vehicles than any enemy action. So, of course, the Germans were trying their best to solve these issues, and what could be improved around the tank was ironed out a bit. The best version would be the final production Model G, which accounted for about half of all Panthers ever built. But still, the core fundamental errors of a 45-ton vehicle built on a 25-ton design structure could not be solved. Now let's talk about the armor, and another problem that haunted the early Panthers horribly. Up front, it carried 80mm of rolled, homogeneous steel armor, sloped at 55 degrees. That angle gave it an effective line-of-sight thickness of about 100 to 39mm, which was quite formidable for the time. The earliest E models had face-hardened armor, but this was eventually replaced with fully tempered rolled plate. The sides were thinner, just 40mm at a 50-degree slope. On the G model, this was bumped to 50mm. The rear deck, though, was a glaring weak spot at only 16mm, which meant even artillery airbursts could go through it. Weak points remained around the hatches, ventilators, and louvers, no matter how much the armor was improved. The original rounded gun mantlet had a dangerous flaw because incoming rounds ricocheted downward into the thin 17mm upper hull right above the driver and radio operator. This so-called shot trap was later corrected with a redesigned mantlet featuring a chin that deflected shots away instead of down. But the biggest problem with the armor was a thin gap on the sides between the sponsons and tracks, where Soviet 14.5mm anti-tank rifles could get through. Side skirts proved to be a stopgap solution, and they worked well enough to reduce the problem. They would tumble the round before it hit the main armor, and were also used on other German tanks for side protection. An interesting thing is that plans were drawn up for a new design that would share parts with the Tiger II, in a project that was supposed to be Panther II. However, only one hull was ever completed before the whole project was scrapped. The Panther's suspension is one of those love-it-or-hate-it features. The overlapping road wheels distributed weight beautifully, giving the Panther excellent cross-country mobility. But mud and ice wedged themselves between those wheels, and when the weather froze overnight, the entire running gear locked solid. More than once, Soviet commanders launched early morning attacks knowing German tanks, Panthers and Tigers that had the same track system simply could not get moving in time. On the positive side, when it worked, the suspension could absorb uneven ground up to half a meter, something unmatched until the Leopard 2 decades later. The trade-off was complexity and constant maintenance headaches. The Soviets, for their part, were so interested in the Panther that when they captured them intact, they ran detailed tests and even used some of them in combat, though reliability issues showed up for them as well. Spare parts were chronically scarce, and the cooling system struggled to keep up at higher revolutions, so it wasn't hard to overheat the engine. The real Achilles heel, though, was the final drive. In early Panthers, it had a lifespan of only about 150 kilometers, while the engine might last 1,000. German records from May 1944 claimed things had improved, with Panthers surviving 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers between overhauls, which was roughly comparable to the Panzer IV. And as the war dragged into 1945, declining production quality meant failures only increased. The gun, however, was the Panther's saving grace. Its main armament was the 75mm KWK 42L70, a weapon that ranks among the best tank guns of the Second World War. The barrel, long at over 5 meters, with an armor-piercing capped round going at 935 meters per second, could penetrate 112mm of armor at a range of 1 kilometer. With the scarce tungsten round, velocity jumped to 1,130 meters per second, and penetration reached 150mm at a 30-degree angle. In practice, the Panther could punch through virtually any Allied tank from well over a mile away. It could put out about 6 rounds per minute, which was not bad. Some variants held 50 shells in a single-side sponson, which was a catastrophic hazard if that quite vulnerable area was ever penetrated. The Panther was actually the first tank to fight with infrared night fighting gear. The FG 1250 system, which paired a spotlight with a scope wired to the gunner, entered trials in late 1944 and saw combat only on the Eastern Front. Western allies had detectors capable of picking up the emissions, so many of the kits were stripped off before they could be used. To be fair, Germany wasn't the only country experimenting with this technology. The Americans tested infrared gear on Shermans as early as 1942, and the Soviets ran night-driving trials, but neither ever made it into combat. Even by the Korean War, tank searchlights still blasted visible white light, and active infrared wouldn't become standard until the 1960s. The Panther's battlefield performance reached its peak in the summer of 1944, when veteran crews were still alive to handle it. After that, attrition steadily eroded the quality of its operators, and training became almost non-existent. Many new Panther crews had little or no live fire experience, and sometimes not even a proper driver's course. It wasn't rare for the crews to go into battle without firing the gun once in training. Unsurprisingly, poorly trained drivers contributed to breakdowns by mishandling gearboxes and overstressing engines. On the Eastern Front, when the Panther was actually running, it was effective. Against Soviet armor, it could cause serious problems, and the Germans even employed Panther turrets as fixed fortifications. These were installed in concrete bunkers along the Siegfried and Atlantic walls, up-armored and reinforced, and they were extremely difficult to destroy, making life miserable for attacking infantry. In Normandy, roughly 400 Panthers were deployed, but the bocage terrain was a nightmare for them. The long 75mm gun struggled to swing in tight hedgerows, and mobility was restricted. When they had a clear line of fire, they inflicted heavy losses on Shermans and Churchills. Yet the close terrain also allowed Allied forces to outflank them, sometimes at very short ranges. British Sherman Fireflies, armed with the 17-pounder, could even destroy Panthers frontally. So the outcome of the fight usually came down to a simple contest: who spotted and fired first. One of the strangest Panther stories came during the Battle of the Bulge. German crews tried disguising 5 of them as American M10 tank destroyers, adding false plates to modify their appearance and painting them with US markings. For a moment it almost worked, but suspicions were raised quickly. American troops soon saw through their cover, and once the trick was blown, all 5 Panthers were destroyed. Turns out, fooling people with fake paint only gets you so far. After the war, the French put about 50 captured Panthers into service from 1946 to 1950. They even managed to solve the infamous engine fire issue. French crews praised the gun and the optics, but without a reliable supply of German spare parts and without full technical knowledge of the design, they struggled to keep them running. Constant breakdowns forced the French to give up on the Panther within a few years. Historians are still divided on the Panther's legacy. Some argue it was probably the best German tank of the war, well designed and well balanced for its time. Others take a more cautious view, admitting it looked impressive, but pointing out the long list of flaws that came with it. And then there are those who dismiss it entirely, saying that despite its powerful specifications, it failed in its intended role in 1943 and never really recovered after that. So, was the Panther a wonder weapon or an overhyped headache? The answer depends on which historian you ask and how many broken transmissions they've had to read about.